Searchers after horror haunt strange far places. For them are the catacombs of Ptolemais and the carven mausolea of the nightmare countries. They climb to the moonlit towers of ruined Rhine castles and falter down black cobweb steps beneath the scattered stones of forgotten cities in Asia. The haunted wood and the desolate mountain are their shrines, and they linger around the sinister monoliths on uninhabited islands. But the true epicure in the terrible, to whom a new thrill of unutterable ghastliness is the chief end of justification of existence, esteems most of all the ancient, lonely farmhouses of backwoods New England. For there, the dark elements of strength, solitude, grotesqueness, and ignorance combine to form the perfection of the hideous. Most horrible of all sights are the little unpainted wooden houses, remote from traveled ways. Usually squatted upon some damp, grassy slope or leaning against some gigantic outcropping of rock. 200 years and more they have leaned or squatted there, while the vines have crawled and the trees have swelled and spread. They are almost hidden now in lawless luxuriances of green and guardian shrouds of shadow, but the small paned windows still stare shockingly, as if blinking through a lethal stupor which wards off madness by dulling the memory of unutterable things. In such houses have dwelt generations of strange people, whose like the world has never seen. Seized with the gloominess and fanatical belief which exiles them from their kind, their ancestors sought the wilderness for freedom. There the scions of a conquering race indeed flourished free from the restrictions of their fellows, but cowered in appalling slavery to the dismal phantasms of their own minds. Divorced from the enlightenment of civilization, the strength of these Puritans turned into singular channels, and in their isolation, morbid self-repression, and struggle for life with relentless nature, there came to them dark, furtive traits from the prehistoric depths of their cold northern heritage. By necessity practical and by philosophy stern, these folk were not beautiful in their sins. Erring as all mortals must, they were forced by their rigid code to seek concealment above all else, so that they came to use less and less taste in what they concealed. Only the silent, sleepy, staring houses in the backwoods can tell us to all that has lain hidden since the early days, and they are not communicative, being loath to shake off the drowsiness which helps them forget. Sometimes one feels that it would be merciful to tear down these houses, for they must often dream. It was to a time-battered edifice of this description that I was driven one afternoon in November 1896 by a rain of such chilling copiousness that any shelter was preferable to exposure. I've been traveling for some time amongst the people of the Miskatonic Valley in quest of certain genealogical data, and from the remote, devious, and problematical nature of my course, had deemed it convenient to employ a bicycle despite the lateness of the season. Now, I found myself upon an apparently abandoned road which I had chosen as the shortest cut to Arkham. Overtaken by the storm at a point far from any town, and confronted with no refuge save the antique and repellent wooden building which blinked with bleared windows. From between two huge leafless elms near the foot of a rocky hill. Distant though it was from the remnant of the road, the house nonetheless impressed me unfavorably the very moment I espied it. Honest, wholesome structures do not stare at travelers so slyly and hauntingly, and in my genealogical researches, I encountered them in legends of a century before, which biased me against places of this kind. Yet the force of the elements was such as to overcome my scruples, and I did not hesitate to wheel my machine up to the weedy rise to a closed door which seemed at once so suggestive and secretive. I had somehow taken it for granted that the house was abandoned, yet as I approached it I was not so sure. For those with the walks indeed overgrown with weeds, they seemed to retain their nature a little too well to argue complete desertion. Therefore, instead of trying the door, I knocked, feeling as I did so a trepidation that I could scarcely explain. As I waited on the rough, mossy rock which served as a doorstep, I glanced at the neighboring windows and the panes of the transom above me. And noticed that although it was old, rattling, and almost opaque with dirt, they were not broken. The building then must still be inhabited, despite its old isolation and general neglect. However, my rapping evoked no response, so after repeating the summons, I tried with the rusty latch and found the door unfastened. Inside was a little vestibule with walls from which the plaster was falling, and through the doorway came a faint but peculiarly hateful odor. I entered, carrying my bicycle, and closed the door behind me. Ahead rose a narrow staircase, flanked by a small door probably leading to the cellar, while to the left and right were doors closed leading to rooms on the ground floor. Leaning my cycle against the wall, I opened the door to the left and crossed into a small low-ceiled chamber, but dimly lighted by its two dusty windows and furnished in the barest and the primitive possible way. Most primitive possible way. It appeared to be a kind of sitting room, for it had a table and several chairs and an immense fireplace above which ticked an antique clock on a mantel. Books and papers were very few, and in prevailing gloom I could not readily discern the titles. What interested me was the uniform air of archaism displayed in every visible detail. Most of the houses in this region I had found rich in relics of the past, but here the antiquity was curiously complete. For in all the room I could not discover a single article of definitely post-revolutionary date. Had the furnishings been less humble, the place would have been a collector's paradise. As I surveyed this quaint apartment, I felt an increase in that aversion first excited by the bleak exterior of the house. Just what it was that I feared or loathed, I could by no means define. But something in the whole atmosphere seemed redolent of the unhallowed age, and unpleasant crudeness, and of secrets which should be forgotten. I felt disinclined to sit down and wandered about, examining the various articles which I had noticed. The first object of my curiosity was a book of medium size lying upon the table, and presenting such an antediluvian aspect that I marveled at beholding it outside a museum or library. It was bound in leather and with metal fittings, and was in an excellent state of preservation, being altogether an unusual sort of volume to encounter in an abode so lowly. When I opened it to title page, my wonder grew even greater. For it proved to be nothing less rare than a pig-fetish account of the Congo region, written in Latin from the notes of the sailor Lopez, and printed at Frankfurt in 1598. I'd often heard of this work, with its curious illustrations by the brothers de Bry, hence for a moment forgot my uneasiness and my desire to turn the pages before me. The engravings were indeed interesting, drawing wholly from imagination and careless descriptions, and represented Negroes with white skin and Caucasian features. Nor would I soon have closed the book had not an exceedingly trivial circumstance upset my tired nerves and revived my sensation of disquiet. What annoyed me was merely the persistent way the volume tended to fall upon open of itself at plate 12, plate 12, which represented in gruesome detail a butcher's shop with a cannibal Anzique. I experienced some shame at my susceptibility to so slight a thing, but the drawing nevertheless disturbed me, especially in connection with some adjacent passage descriptive of Anzique gastronomy. I turned to a neighboring shelf and was examining its meager literary contents. An 18th century Bible, a Pilgrim's Progress of the like period, illustrated with grotesque woodcuts and printed with an almanac maker Isaiah Thomas, the writing bulk of Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana, and some other few books of evidently equal age, when my attention was aroused by the unmistakable sound of walking in the room overhead. At first astonished and startled, considering the lack of response to my recent knocking at the door, I immediately afterward concluded that the walker had just awakened from a sound sleep, and listened with less surprise at the footsteps sounded on the creaking stairs. The tread was heavy, yet seemed to contain a curious quality of cautiousness, a quality which I disliked more because the tread was heavy. When I entered the room, I shut the door behind me. Now, after a moment of silence during which the walker must have been inspecting my bicycle in the hall, I heard a fumbling at the latch and saw the paneled portal swing open again. In the doorway stood a person of such singular appearance that I should have exclaimed aloud but for the restraints of good breeding. Old, white-bearded, and ragged, my host possessed a countenance and physique which inspired equal wonder and respect. His height could not have been less than 6 feet, and despite a general air of poverty, he was stout and powerful in proportion. His face, almost hidden by a long beard, which grew high on the cheeks, seemed abnormally ruddy and less wrinkled than one might expect, while over a high forehead fell a shock of white hair, little thinned by the years. His blue eyes, though a trifle bloodshot, seemed inexplicably keen and burning. But for his horrible unkemptness, the man would have been distinguished looking, as he was impressive. This unkemptness, however, made him offensive despite his face and figure. Of what his clothing consisted I could hardly tell, for it seemed to me no more than a mass of tatters surmounting a pair of heavy boots, and his lack of cleanliness surpassed description. The appearance of this man, and the instinctive fear he inspired, prepared me for something like enmity, for so that I shuddered through surprise and a sense of uncanny incongruity when he motioned me to a chair and addressed me in a thin, weak voice full of fawning respect and ingratiating hospitality. His speech was very curious, an extreme form of Yankee dialect, though I thought long and extinct, and studied it closely as he sat opposite me for conversation. "Catched in the rain, be ye?" he greeted. "Glad ye was nigh the house and had the sense to come riding. I calculated I was asleep, else I'd be heard ye. I ain't as young as I used to be, and I need a powerful sight on naps nowadays. Traveling far? I hadn't seen many folks along this road since they took off the Arkham stage." I replied that I was going to Arkham, and apologized for my rude entry into this domicile, whereupon he continued. Glad to see you, young sir. Young new faces is scarce around here, and I ain't got much to cheer me up these days. Guess you hail from Boston, don't you? Never been there, but I could tell a town man when I see him. We had one for district schoolmaster in '84, but he quit suddenly and no one heard him since. Here the old man lapsed into a kind of chuckle and made no explanation when I questioned him. He seemed to be in an unboundedly good humor, yet to possess those eccentricities one might have guessed from his grooming. For some time he rambled on with almost feverish geniality, and when it struck me to ask him how he came by so rare a book as the Pigfettus Regnum Condo, the effect of the volume had not left me, and I thought a certain hesitancy in speaking of it. But curiosity overmastered all the vague fears which had steadily accumulated since my first glimpse of the house.